Leanne squirmed a bit under the gazes of the two footmen who joined them in the carriage's cabin. They had the good looks that came with being a noble, and being foreigners gave them an exotic flavor that she couldn't help but be drawn to. Their attention to her was pleasing, but her serious experience with that sort of attention was next to non-existent, and she wrestled with how she should present herself. Beyond that, this is weird, right? This is definitely weird. Why are they looking at me and not Florine? Men always looked at Florine. Women did, too. Leanne Loretta Dale Wagner was practically invisible in the presence of the unstoppable juggernaut of feminine charm that was Florine Cadia Dale Gagne. Leanne, say something. Huh? Oh, Since the two noblemen were working as footmen, she was the ranking member in the group and thus had to lead the conversation. A bump in the road gave her an excuse to look out the carriage window and gather her thoughts. Worry not, Lady Wagner, a reassuring voice came from the seat opposite hers. We have made sure that the city is safe from beastmen. Like Ludmilla would leave any for you. Even if there were beastmen, Ludmilla said that their equipment was good enough that, if the average beastman observed so far appeared to attack them, Leanne and Florine would each be able to win on their own. While they weren't wearing their dresses, they still had the rest of their accessories on, so a part of her wanted it to happen just so she could see how the footman would react. It wasn't anything like that, Leanne smiled. My house is involved in transport, so I couldn't help but examine the roads and the carriage. Is that so? Was there something wrong with what she said? Though the man had stuttered, their polite masks gave nothing else away. We're not called House Wagner for nothing, Leanne said. What about you? Come to think of it, the captain never introduced us. Our apologies, my lady, the man bent forward in his seat. I am Zoran Kao, second son of House Kao. Arga Binasai, the other man lowered his head in greeting as well, second son of House Binasai. The tall one outside is Amod Zulu, son of House Zulu. The other is Kipala Auras, third son of House Auras. She stared at the tops of their sandy-haired heads, each topped with some sort of fez with a white tassel. Leanne Loretta Dale Wagner, Countess of Wagner, you'll have to forgive us, but we've yet to learn about how greetings are exchanged in the Draconic Kingdom. It is our pleasure to be your guides to our customs, my lady. Zoran raised his head. The ones we enact as footmen are traditional, but not too serious. Our queen dislikes it when her nobles put too much weight into traditions that she considers pointlessly ceremonial. As Her Majesty prefers functionality over form, our conduct with guests is usually tailored to suit their preferences. Florine Cadia Dale Gagne. Florine lowered her head in greeting. Baroness of Gagne. It is a pleasure to meet you, Zoran, Arga. Likewise, Baroness Gagne, Zoran said. We were all surprised to see that the members of your delegation were all women, barring the royal butler. Is he? Even more surprising is that you hold titles in your own right. The rumors that travel the palace corridors say that you inherited after your new sovereign pressed his claim. Is this true? It is, Leanne replied. I see, Zoran nodded solemnly. Such is our lot in life. Your honorable sires have our respect and our gratitude. They must have cherished you greatly for such vibrant blossoms to flower in their passing. The carriage rumbled over an intersection as a moment of silence passed between them. At the least, it seemed that there was a shared respect for aristocratic obligation between nobles in the Draconic Kingdom and those in the north. Thank you for your kind words, Lord Zoran, Leanne said. Or is it Lord Kao? I fear to ask after your family given what happened in the palace quarter. Lord Zoran for the time being, my lady. The four of us are all from other territories and our families were not in the capital. House Kao is a bit west of Fallujah in the north. House Binasai is north of Corin on the lake and House Auras is south of there. House Salu's lands are next to Eastwatch. We have not received word from the eastern reach in over a year, but there is still yet hope. Chances were that they had indeed inherited, but it wouldn't be proper to treat them as lords in their own right until things became official. In that case, Leanne said, let's continue to hope for the best. Since the situation is turning around now, there must be some things that you'd like to help your houses out with. Zoran and Arga exchanged looks. The needs of our houses should not be too different from the rest of the realm, Arga said. In that case, Leanne grinned, we'd like to hear all about it. The only things we hear about the Draconic Kingdom up north is how they always get picked on by beastmen. That's certainly far from everything about us, my lady, Zoran said. Then let's head over to a nice restaurant or inn, Leanne said. Learning more about your country would help make everything go that much smoother. Arga opened the window to speak to the men accompanying the carriage outside. Leanne watched the citizens going about their business along the street. While they had cleaned the place up, signs of the recent Beastman breach were still abundant. Most notable was the damage that was not so easy to repair: broken windows, missing stretches of magical lighting, and pretty much anything that required new materials to fix. As for the people themselves, they seemed strangely resolute about their situation. There were no overt signs of unrest or distress. Doesn't this city seem super stable for a place that just got ransacked by man-eating beastmen? It is, but it shouldn't be surprising. You should have a good measure of Queen Auriculus by now. Yeah, but this is a ridiculously powerful effect. It's way stronger than what we saw in our winter. You think she's doing it for her entire kingdom? That would be amazing if she could. I can't even imagine how much work would go into achieving that. Maybe she gets something special from being a dragon lord. I wonder about that. Shouldn't dragons be on the dominator side of the spectrum? The ones we know about so far, yeah. But there are a lot of different types of dragons out there. As far as they understood, lords had various effects over those that they ruled. Those various effects varied by race, and even within a races there could be different types of lords. Their grasp of things was still extremely rough, but they were slowly starting to make sense of what they saw as time and experience brought new insights. Several loosely defined scales had been created to help them categorize a lord-class individual and how their abilities affected the world around them. The first that they agreed upon was the civilian martial spectrum, which was evidenced by the differences between nobles of civilian and martial leanings in human society. Lords on the martial side of the spectrum had qualities that lent towards them being effective leaders in hostile or otherwise adverse conditions, hardening those that they ruled against those conditions and serving as something like a commander or champion of their people. Lords on the civilian side of the spectrum excelled at amplifying the effectiveness of their subjects and leveraging what they had at their disposal. This spectrum loosely explained why Ludmilla was absolute crap at many things that nobles normally excelled at. Her lord job class simply didn't allow it. By the same token, Leanne, Florine and Clara stunk at many things Ludmilla excelled at. Their combat and command ability was limited, it was difficult for them to work with very little, and their loyal subjects weren't as resilient. Trying to make up for those deficiencies through personal development didn't help, either. Well, it was more that Clara and Ludmilla asserted that it was harmful. At first, Leanne was skeptical since the tenets of the faith of the Six served as the basis for their assertion, but then Ludmilla pointed out that members of the Sorceress Kingdom's royal court confirmed that it was the case. Build contamination, they called it. If someone tried too hard to do something that wasn't in line with their vocation, they would pick up job class levels that were fundamentally incompatible with their builds - the sum of what they were, as defined by their class levels. Fixing that problem involved dying and losing levels. Leanne wasn't very keen on experiencing that particular solution, so she decided that investigating the truth of the matter without potentially putting herself at risk was prudent. The second spectrum that they fleshed out had to do with the fundamental nature of a lord's race. This was developed by comparing the different peoples that lived in the Sorceress Kingdom that they encountered while Florine wandered about. It was more like a set of measures that helped them figure out where any particular race sat in the grand scheme of things. This included how social they were, whether they were collaborators or dominators, and their inherent strengths as individuals and as a species. Quagga and goblins, for instance, were more social than humans. The Quagga were more on the dominator side of the spectrum and tended to behave aggressively against other races when left to their own devices. Goblins were on the collaborator side, capable of easily fitting into the order of other societies. While they had distinct racial advantages, Quagga were not especially strong relative to humans. Goblins were generally weaker than regular humans. Lords of both races had skills and abilities that reflected these traits. A Quagga lord could invoke a berserk state over their people that exploited their resilience in their natural environment, turning them into a difficult-to-break wave of frenzied soldiers. Hobgoblins, which might be considered a sort of goblin lord, brought together and transformed the various goblinoid species and their ecology into the organized and disciplined ranks of a goblin army. The third major spectrum for lords class individuals had to do with the organizational bracket that they filled. There was the tribal bracket, which could be seen in the most common sorts of demi-human lords, or minor nobles, in the case of human kingdoms and empires. Above them were higher lords, which were the rarer high chiefs, warlords or petty kings of tribal confederations, or the high nobles of human countries. Higher up were sovereigns, consisting of kings, emperors and other analogous roles. When compared with the human sovereigns of the north, Queen Auricula's was far more impressive in terms of apparent mastery over her lord-type classes. Whether consciously doing so or not, she displayed powerful abilities both directly and could be seen reflected in her loyal subjects, which somehow appeared to be all of them. Rather than a regular queen, she was probably better categorized as a high queen. One might ask where Ainzul Gaon, the sorcerer king, sat in all of this. Understanding, however, only required a shift in perspective. Like the living, the undead had lords too. According to Lady Shaltia, Ainzul Gaon was an overlord the highest existence of the Elder Lich line. Elder Liches were often coined as Lords of the Labyrinth, Lords of the Undead and commanders of undead armies who exerted their influence through arcane might and necromantic domination. Additionally, as a necromancer of the highest caliber, Ainzul Gaon was a ruler of death. When the various spectrums that they had come up with were applied, it framed the Sorcerer King in a reasonably understandable way. He was the highest rank of sovereign, belonged to the dominator side of things and displayed traits characteristic of his race. These notions were loosely proven by how he affected those around him. Without exception, everyone could feel the dark majesty of the Sorcerer King when they were in his presence. Depending on one's relationship to the Sorcerer King, the dark majesty could evoke different feelings. To outsiders, he was a personification of death. The unsettling sensations that the living felt in the presence of the undead were amplified. With respect and loyalty, however, came awe and reverence. As an undead lord, the Sorcerer King also had various effects on the undead under his command and did things to naturally occurring ones. As far as they had observed, the more human types of undead, particularly the females, fell helplessly in love or at least lusted after him. Those further removed from being human including skeletal undead, incorporeal undead and zombies, were exposed to other sets of emotions. Broadly speaking, the undead became more like the living around him, experiencing emotions and reactions to a degree that was normally not characteristic of the undead. It was a strange phenomenon that allowed the undead to become closer to the life that they emulated. Their carriage started moving again, going around a city block and heading back up the way they came. Liane concealed a frown at the change in direction. They wouldn't be able to see much of the city if they just stayed around the palace. "Is there an establishment you've decided on?" she asked. "Yes, my lady," Zoran answered with a nod. "One of the finest restaurants in the city. It is high in the palace quarter and commands a most wonderful view of the river and the east of the city. We have chosen it more for the atmosphere than the food," Arga said. "With the city harboring over twice its usual population, the common establishments are cramped and squalid. Additionally, the rationing measures in the city affect all, so we beg your understanding in the matter." "That shouldn't last for much longer," Liane replied. "Well, everyone might be eating oat bread, oatmeal, oatcakes, oat pastries and other oat derivatives for a while, but at least you'll have plenty of it." The carriage went through a series of hairpin turns leading up the eastern side of the palace quarter, bringing them to a flat residential area with the restaurant in question at the end of the road. Each manor along the way was in various states of disrepair, displaying damage more pronounced than in the streets of the common areas below. Unlike the common areas, little effort had been made to clean things up. "If the city is overcrowded," Florine finally found the courage to speak, "would it not be prudent to open the palace quarter to the citizens?" "Such proposals have been made, Lady Garnier," Zoran replied, "but there are other considerations we must see to first. Every residence here belongs to a noble house or other important personages. The beastmen may have taken the staff and valuables, but what is valuable to humans is not necessarily valuable to beastmen. Every manor is filled with paperwork, sensitive documents, vaults and hidden chambers. We presently do not have the means available to secure everything or manage the population should they decide to engage in criminal acts. Having people filling the quarter is a recipe for disaster, especially when times are so desperate." "If that's the case," Liane asked, "how are the people being managed right now?" "Very carefully." Zoran's dark eyes glinted as he offered her a lopsided smile. The people believe in the grace of our queen and will go to great ends to serve her. They would even sacrifice themselves for her sake. We must maintain this state and work to avoid anything that might adversely affect it where possible. Is it just me, Lian, or did that come off as not quite right? What do you mean? Makes sense to me. They're upholding the dignity of the queen and the majesty of her reign, yay? Normal aristocrat stuff. That feels right and wrong at the same time. The carriage came to a stop in front of a hastily cleared walkway. Pieces of debris and refuse were piled up some distance to the sides. One of the footmen outside, Amod, opened the cabin door and unfolded a small set of steps. We informed the proprietor in advance of our arrival, Lady Wagner, Zoran said, so it shouldn't be long until their preparations have been made. In the meantime, please enjoy the view from the gardens. Amod lowered his head slightly, silently extending a hand to Lian. Out of the 4 footmen, he was the most handsome by far. He was 2 meters tall with a dusky complexion and sturdy frame that might have been the result of being from a border house in the east. That smile of yours is silly. Lian unsmiled. I can't help it. It's not every day that people pay more attention to me than they do to you. Can I use your shawl, by the way? No. They disembarked from the cabin, finding Rose and Tiare already awaiting them on the walkway. Their ladies' maids had followed them in a second carriage which was about as nondescript as theirs. Like Lian and Florine, their maids had donned a set of local attire that complemented their own. Shall we go ahead and check the premises, my lady? Rose asked. I shall accompany you, as well, Amod said in a deep voice. Lian's gaze met that of her ladies' maids. Take one of our shadow demons too. The shadow demon went from Lian's shadow to Rose's, and the 3 disappeared into the restaurant. Zoran guided Lian and Florine to a garden walkway offering a view of the city's eastern riverfront. Every few meters, they passed a giant splotch of dry blood on the cobblestones. This wasn't what I had in mind, Zoran said sheepishly. Don't mind us, Lian said. Don't throw up, though. With the palace quarter on the western side of the city, the eastern district stretched 2 kilometers along the banks of the river Orichalon. The shadow cast by the palace quarter shrouded the riverfront in darkness, making it difficult to discern the state of its port facilities. What's the condition of the city's eastern port? Lian asked. Is it comparable to the west? Auras, Zoran said. Weren't you patrolling there today? Yes, Lord Zoran, the shorter man said. The wharf district has always been a bit on the seedier side, but the facilities themselves remain functional. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same for the vessels moored there. Baroness Saradnik mentioned something like that in her reports, Lian said. The beastmen were sinking ships in ports all along the coast. I guess they didn't want their food to sail away. Grave looks appeared on the faces of the men standing across from them. All of them? Zoran frowned. That's not good. The river trade is crucial to the Draconic Kingdom's economy. Not only does it facilitate efficient transport, but it is difficult for beastmen to disrupt. It probably shouldn't take long to repair. If it were better days, yes. With our supply chains effectively collapsed, we'll have to cannibalize a lot of ships. Materials in general are scarce with the strain of the recovery effort. What about magic casters? The 3 footmen exchanged looks. May I ask what you mean by that, my lady? Zoran asked. Magic casters can cast spells to repair stuff, yeah? Lian answered. Low-tier mending line spells should be able to tide you over until real repairs can be made and new ships built. Such things are beyond our knowledge, Zoran replied, but it sounds like powerful magic that we wouldn't have access to. I said low-tier, right? You did. I'm sure you can consult with the guilds on that, Lian said. A city of this size should have more than a few magic casters. In better times, that might be the case. I have a feeling we'll be hearing that a lot. But magic casters are purposely targeted by beastmen. I am uncertain how many remain after this latest attack. I guess we should add timber to our shipments, Lian muttered. Of all the things one needed, wood was probably one of the easiest to get. She couldn't think of any instance of human-managed territory losing its copses or not having any forests, but it might be different in the Draconic Kingdom where beastmen could just pop out of the trees and eat people. My lady, Rose returned from the restaurant. The restaurant is ready to receive you. Find anything interesting? Lian asked. Not as such. The usual set of divination spells revealed nothing of note. Nor did we discover anything on the mundane end of things. They were led inside through the restaurant to a balcony on the other side. Sconces set with torches lined the walls and pillars, supporting a structure fashioned from polished cedar. In the middle of the balcony was a long table set with golden utensils and tall beeswax candles. Once they took their seats, a short man in a white chef's uniform appeared to greet them. "Welcome, lords and ladies, welcome. I am Chef Remily, proprietor of the Dragon's Roost. We are most pleased that you have chosen our establishment this evening." Remily, Zoran nodded. "It's good to see you healthy. When we heard what happened to the palace quarter, I feared the worst." "You are too kind, Lord Zoran," the chef replied. "By the Queen's grace, we managed to survive. My staff and I locked ourselves in the cellars when the beastmen overwhelmed the city's defenses, but we're not quite sure what happened next. By the time we grew brave enough to come out again, the invaders were gone." Does that mean that some of the palace quarters residents might still be alive?" "It's been 4 or 5 days since the attack began, so they should have reappeared by now if so. Speaking of residents, I don't believe I've met these lovely young ladies you've brought with you today." "Ah." Zoran rose from his seat and gestured to Liane. "This is Wagner." Liane stood up and stuck out her hand. "Liane Wagner. My partner here is Florine Gagné. These are our attendants, Rose and Thierry. We're merchants from a place up north." The chef instantly latched onto her introduction, clasping her hand. "Merchants, you say? Might that mean that goods are arriving in the port?" "You betcha," she grinned. "We're currently negotiating supply arrangements with Her Majesty." "That's..." Chef Remily swallowed. "If you'll please excuse me for just one moment." "Sure." Chef Remily scampered away into the restaurant. The 4 footmen cast curious looks at Liane as she sat back down. "I don't understand, my la Miss Wagner. Why would you?" "We didn't lie to Liane said. "We are merchants." "But what she means to say, Lord Zoran," Florine rolled her eyes, "is that we are from merchant houses." "I see. No, I don't. I still don't understand why you would choose to introduce yourselves as merchants rather than nobles." The sound of heavy breathing preceded the chef as he returned to the balcony. "Apologies, my lords," he said, "there was an urgent matter that demanded my attention." "Of course, Remily." Zoran's voice was uncertain. "What is this evening's menu? We've had a long day seeing to the order of the city." Chef Remily launched himself into a flowery rendering of what was pretty close to what they'd been eating for the last day or so. The only notable difference was the wine, which was some sort of decade-old red from the far end of the Orichalon Reach. Once the chef confirmed their satisfaction with the content of their dinner, Liane and Florine stuck with the wine since they had just eaten. He disappeared into the restaurant again. "So you've all been performing duties with the city militia," Liane said. "How's that been working out for you?" "They can hardly be called proper militia," Zoran snorted. "Indeed." Arga joined him in his mirth. "Remember Amod's first watch? He equipped his men with spears and half of them nearly stabbed themselves. I think a few of them did." The men's laughter rose around the table. Amod scratched his temple, casting his eyes down in embarrassment. "This is the least of the problems, though." Kipler's almond eyes glittered with amusement. "The commoners have little sense for law. We spent more time dealing with our men than with any problems created by the citizenry. They judge things based on whether they believe good or evil is being done, not what is lawful and unlawful." "It should be expected, should it not?" Florine said. "We ourselves were not born with the law instilled in us, but we all have a sense of good and evil." "True," Zoran said, "true. But it goes a long way in explaining why they do so many nonsensical things. They have much in the way of common sense but everything else is." Zoran leaned back in his seat and raised his hand, making a swirling gesture with a look of resignation. "I don't envy you guys," Liane said. "Recovering from this giant mess is going to take a good, long time. Well, since you all basically have your foot in the door now, do you plan on seeing things through and securing positions in the royal court?" That is a good question. Normally, we would all be ecstatic at such an opportunity. Given how things are, however, Auras, what do you think?" "It would depend on the state of our houses," Arga said. "If we end up inheriting, we would have to take care of things at home. Should the territories fall apart, there would be no country for the ministries to manage. I doubt my lord father has perished, Kippola said. He's so obstinate that, if he were eaten, he'd crawl right back out. The judiciary is not for me, though. I would prefer the treasury. Arga's look turned sour. You would have to fight the Delaros for the position. I don't think you could win, Zoran said. She is close to the queen and more talented in finance than you besides. I don't mind working under Delaros. The three men turned suspicious looks at Kippola. What? Kippola said. Nothing. Zoran looked over to Amod. What about you, Amod? Back to Eastwatch, I suppose. Amod nodded and took a sip from his wine. As expected of a son of House Zulu, Zoran raised a fist. Considering the help we are receiving from the Sorceress Kingdom, perhaps you should aim for Marshal instead? There will be others more suited to the position. Amod shook his head. The cities of the north still stand, so the nobles commanding their defense would be a better choice than I. Think we should tell him that they're only standing because they're being kept fresh? Don't do that. He looks so gallant right now. He did, but knowing the truth made Liane want to laugh at his tragically misplaced humility. Chef Remily and his staff arrived with the first of their courses, a thin fish stew with pickled vegetables that was at great odds with the crystal bowls that it came in. Still, the 4 footmen conducted themselves in a manner appropriate to the setting rather than the food. At any rate, Zoran said, seeing order return to the city brings us great satisfaction, but many things will demand our attention in the future. Speaking of the future, Liane said, what do you think the best measures would be to help get the Draconic Kingdom on the road to recovery? Zoran took a few spoonfuls of soup with a thoughtful expression. Since you are unfamiliar with our country, he said, there are a few fundamental things that you should be aware of. One of them is that the Draconic Kingdom is structured as a product of our relationship with our neighbors. We are regularly subjected to beastmen raids and the way that we recover from their predation has been refined over generations. That sounds interesting. Liane leaned forward. How does it work, logistically speaking? The footman emptied his bowl, dabbing at his lips with a napkin before speaking again. At the center of everything lies our queen, he said. Both legally and logistically speaking. Every city in the Draconic Kingdom is under the direct rule of the royal house. We are not like the countries of the north where great houses rule over cities. While there are high nobles in the Draconic Kingdom, there are no great houses as you would recognize them, only provincial lords. I see, Liane said. So whenever a territory is attacked by beastmen, the queen sends support directly to the lord that needs it through her cities. The system is set up in such a way that each city acts as a branch of the central administration. That's right, Zoran nodded. I was expecting that this would require a more in-depth explanation. My father always bemoaned the ignorance of northern dignitaries. They always asked for the lord of whatever place held their interest so that they could negotiate directly with them for licenses and such. The Sorceress Kingdom's central administration holds absolute authority, Florian explained. Legally speaking, this is not the case, but it is in practice. The destructive factionalism that you might hear of in the north is pointless in our country. Speaking of factions, Liane said, do they exist here? They do, Zoran said, but they are provincial factions rather than what northerners would call court factions. The administrators of each area in a province band together to more effectively represent their interests. So what happens in a situation like the one you're in presently, where everyone needs everything at the same time? Our hairs turn grey before we reach the age of 20, Arga grimaced. Maybe Kippola has the right idea. What do you mean by that? Kippola frowned. Nothing, Arga smiled slightly. What will probably happen is that support will be distributed in an equitable fashion across all provinces. Everyone will request as much as they can, of course, but, at the same time, they should recognize that we all share the same circumstances and trust in our queen's wisdom. This makes it really easy for us. Suspiciously easy. Well, it's a good system. Why would you think we'd be the first ones to think of it? Especially when they're the ones that have to deal with this all the time. Still, it existing before we proposed it might be bad for us. But it's effectively a bigger, time-tested version of what we came up with. That's the problem. They're very queeny. It's as if everything is set up with Queen Auriculus at the center. If we do something similar, we may be seen as undermining the influence of the crown. If that was the case, wouldn't she have said something about it? I don't think it's the Queen we have to worry about. Lian eyed the handsome young nobleman sitting across the table from them. They were indeed very queeny. From what they had seen, all of the Draconic Kingdom's subjects were. They might have difficulties between themselves, but the Queen was simply above it all. If anyone targeted the Queen for a reason, it would be to shower their adoration upon her. She glanced over at Florine, who was smiling gently as she watched the restaurant staff lay out the next course. You know, just this once, I hope you're wrong. 10th day, Upper Wind Month, 1 CE, 1900 hours. Keep our infantry in the river off of the capital for now. The General Staff wants us to focus reconnaissance on the north side of the Orichalon for the next few days. What of our cavalry, my lady? Psycho asked. They're fine on their current patrol routes, Ludmilla answered. What we need right now is information, and we need to gain as much of it as we can before the beastmen start sniffing around. Did you not say that the beastmen beyond the borders of the duchy will not intrude on these lands due to the lack of food? I did, Ludmilla nodded. But, in this case, I'm referring to any regular interactions between all of these clans. The human countries of this region are accustomed to demi-humans existing in primitive, disparate tribes that have few relationships beyond competitive ones. Our adversary is a country and is sending migrants to settle these lands, meaning that some attempt at creating trade networks and establishing permanent territorial governments should occur eventually. They may not come for food, but they may start doing something like selling food to the overpopulated areas here. Since this occupation has lasted a while, it may already be happening. It was a good thing that her friends had pointed that particular detail out, as she had overlooked it entirely. Though it shouldn't have been a strange notion if one took a step back and examined things, the state of the region and the relationship between human countries and their tribal demi-human neighbors jumbled up what was normal and abnormal. While accompanying the 6th Legion on their southern campaign, she didn't identify a single demi-human merchant. The Empire did see the occasional demi-human merchant from Carnassus, so, presumably, the lack of them in the Imperial frontier was because of the slain theocracy's active suppression of their populations. That influence did not extend to the Beastman country bordering the Draconic Kingdom, however, so it was reasonable to expect behaviors characteristic of civilized society in whatever analogues they existed in. Not long ago, she considered the slain theocracy's efforts to keep the region safe for the development of humanity an essential thing. Now, she wondered whether it had done more harm than good. The resulting segregation of races resulted in a state where mutually beneficial relations could never be achieved. His Majesty's decision to extend his benevolence over not just humanity, but all peoples of the world only made more sense the more of the world that Ludmilla saw. It couldn't happen immediately, but the harmonious state that the Sorcerer King desired could be achieved once the damage being dealt to the region's civilizations was stopped and His Majesty's order facilitated mutual understanding and prosperity. In that case, Psycho asked, what should be done if we encounter a merchant or some other civilian operating within our zone of control? That's a good question. She crossed her arms and pursed her lips. As far as I know, it's a near-universal norm of civilized conduct to allow merchants right of passage regardless of their race or country of origin. In the Sorceress Kingdom, arbitrarily attacking non-hostile merchants and other civilians lawfully going about their business would be a major breach of our policies and legislation. In the Draconic Kingdom, well, I'll consult with Queen Auriculus on the matter. It's her country. Is there anything else to address before I head into the city? The elder liches gathered around her exchanged looks between themselves. They were doing well so far, so she was hoping that they would eventually become confident enough in their duties to voice independent thoughts and opinions. Unlike the elder liches of the Sorceress Kingdom's administration, who always seemed to have something to say about everything, the elder liches of the royal army were generally quiet and obedient. A minute passed in silence before she spoke again. In that case, Psycho and I are heading to the palace. If you have any thoughts or concerns while you conduct your duties, I'm just a message spell away. Don't hesitate to ask me about anything you're unsure about. Her sergeants saluted as she activated her hairpin and rose into the air. Psycho fell into formation on her right. Out of curiosity, Ludmilla said. Do the sergeants confer between themselves? Occasionally. What about? Most of the time, Psycho told her, it has to do with the coordination of our forces. There are also minor checks and status updates between themselves and the general staff. Is there any non-routine discourse? The Elder Lich fell silent as they leveled out 500 meters over the ground and headed straight towards the city. Was there some concern that you had about your sergeants, my lady?
It may just be me, Ludmilla said. His Majesty's servitors can silently communicate with one another. I can only imagine what sort of chatter goes on between everyone, so I suppose it feels as if I am being left out. We are generally not ones for chatter, Psycho replied, but I suppose it does happen. Ludmilla flipped around and flew backwards, facing the Elder Lich as they crossed over the city wall. Really, now, she smiled, what about? It isn't some secret, I hope. Not particularly. For the past 2 days, it has revolved around improvements to squad performance and adjusting our expectations to match the bonuses that your influence confers upon us. See? That's just the sort of thing I like talking about, yet it only crosses my desk after everyone's done having fun with it. Since they were operating on relatively large battlefields, opportunities to observe what individual squads were doing were limited. Even then, she only had a general idea of what they were up to until they started doing it. They had brought force enough to crush countries in their entirety, but it was still important to refine their tactical and strategic processes as well as expand their understanding of the world. As we do not have commander-class communication abilities, including you in these discussions would be problematic. The mana expenditure from the constant use of message spells would be prohibitive. Moo. You are not a lizard man. How do you know about that? Ludmilla frowned. Psycho silently stared back at her. Well, at least report to the general staff so they can note things as they develop for me to look at. I have Olga and Raoul now, so I've basically doubled my personnel. They have not displayed any class skills or abilities as commanders yet, Psycho noted. They're still apprentices, Ludmilla replied. As far as we've observed, the capabilities of apprentice-type job classes only offer rudimentary skill sets in the associated vocation. They've been training all winter, though, so don't underestimate what they're capable of. What are they capable of? That's part of what we're here to find out. They've at least grasped a wide breadth of mundane tactics, strategy and simple logistics. I need to get them started on skill and ability development soon. Much of what I've come up with is theoretical, to be honest. It draws from what I've been able to study and make sense out of. As far as she knew, the method of instruction for commanders was akin to other types of apprenticeships. One learned theory, and then applied it in practice. It was even the same with far more capable commanders like Gunnar and the Goblin General, as well as the Imperial Military Academy, which was steeped in generations of formalized martial tradition. A part of her suspected that the basic feeling their military education gave off was due to the limited knowledge of educational techniques in the region, but it was the only thing that they had. Lady Shiltir and even Grand Marshal Cocytus were limited in their knowledge of military operations. This was somewhat understandable since they were unfathomably strong and could personally tackle any issues that required martial strength, but that didn't help with the Royal Army's development. They angled down towards the Royal Palace and Ludmilla watched the city pass below. With how crowded it was, she couldn't imagine what it was like when it had twice as many hiding behind its walls. Gangs of boys and men worked to clear away the damage left behind by the Beastman rampage, and it looked like every fifth building was being torn down. Women of all ages waited in lines that wound around the city blocks, waiting to purchase food and other necessities from shops and warehouses guarded by burly security personnel. This was in stark contrast to the palace quarter, where barely anyone could be seen. While it appeared that the citizens were being kept out, the sheer disrepair of the quarter suggested that, rather than any sort of segregation occurring, something else was keeping them from using the area. Occasionally, wagons filled with corpses trundled through the streets on the way to unloading their grisly cargo in one of the quarter's expansive gardens. Have there been any reports of undead rising in the aftermath of the attack? Ludmilla asked. If it has occurred, Psycho replied, reports have not reached us. Your query is in line with our curiosity over a lack of negative energy-related phenomena in the wake of these events. That's good to hear, Ludmilla said. The last thing we need is a request for domestic security tying up our troops. Indeed. At least a part of the reason why no negative energy phenomena had manifested was due to her. As with the 6th Legion's decisive battle in the Highlands, Ludmilla could sense that she was absorbing the negative energy produced as a consequence of her force's actions.
Once her infantry company grew accustomed to the routine of clearing out sections of the city, they were swift and efficient about it, completing the bulk of their task in under 2 hours. While her experience with negative energy was limited, it appeared that the folklore and common sense regarding its formation were at least partially correct. Widespread belief pinned the cause of negative energy as the result of certain events and what living beings, regardless of race or culture, considered conditions conducive to undeath. The most common source was the accumulation of corpses in areas such as cemeteries, mausoleums, mass graves and battlefields. This was evidenced by the fact that weak undead commonly manifested in those places, which was a constant thorn in the side of city budgets. Remains that were not attended to properly were said to be a greater source of negative energy. As far as Ludmilla could observe, the true cause was vague. She could sense the negative energy suffusing her surroundings, but there wasn't anything obvious like clouds of the stuff wafting out from burial sites like the malevolent miasma that some described it as. Much to the probable disappointment of those who obsessed over necromancy, the generation of negative energy from those sources was so gradual that she couldn't sense its formation, only the cumulative result. The second most common cause attributed to the appearance of negative energy was death as a result of wars or disasters. As an officer of the Royal Army, this was immediately relevant to her work. Militaries in the texts that she studied often factored the phenomena into strategic planning. Warfare of all types, be it a pitched battle or a minor raid, was linked to the generation of negative energy. Purposely choosing battle sites that could afford to be infused with negative energy, such the Katsa Plains, which was used in the wars between Riastais and Baharuth, limiting collateral damage and ensuring that the rank and file didn't lose discipline and run rampant over enemy population centers were all examples of measures made to limit the propagation of negative energy. When it came to the Draconic Kingdom, the apparent fact that Ludmilla only absorbed negative energy she was responsible for meant that everything generated by the beastmen as they slaughtered the human population stuck around. To her senses, it appeared as a wispy layer that clung to the city like vestiges of morning mist collecting at the bottoms of bowls and ravines. Also of particular note was the fact that her counteroffensive actually resulted in less negative energy than what the beastmen had produced in their massacre of the citizens, despite the overwhelming violence of the former. Either the number of dead, over 200,000 caused by the beastmen versus the 40,000 slain by her forces, or the way that they died was what resulted in the difference. That being said, she wasn't sure if the assault on the capital had produced enough to trigger undead genesis. Understanding where that threshold lay was a priority for her, as the lengthy occupation could very well have generated more negative energy in other parts of the Draconic Kingdom. Ludmilla slowed as they crossed over a group of temple staff attending to a pyre. She turned to address Psycho. "Go on ahead and report to headquarters. I'm going to speak with those priests below." She landed behind a hedgerow before dropping her concealment. After swapping into her civilian garb, she walked around to greet them. "Good evening." The half-dozen men and women attending the pyre jumped at her voice. It seemed that beastmen weren't the only ones plagued by poor situational awareness in the Draconic Kingdom. One of the men, who had raised a symbol of the water god in her direction, peered at her suspiciously. "Is there some reason why everyone is so jumpy?" Ludmilla asked. "Some reason?" The man's reply was incredulous. "Have you not seen all the undead?" Ludmilla looked to her left, and then to her right. Then she leaned slightly to the side to look past the nervous priests. "Have any undead manifested as a result of all the corpses? You have quite the tremendous backlog of rites to perform." "No," the man said. "They haven't, but those are the least of our problems. You nobles have barred the gates to keep people from seeing what's going on out there, but I have it on good authority that that army of darkness is still lurking about. It's even said that they're holding our beloved queen hostage." "You'd think that us nobles would be a bit more distraught if that was the case." Ludmilla raised an eyebrow. "Humph, spare me your games. We have work to do, so you will have to excuse us." With that, they turned back to resume their prayers. Ludmilla walked off with an ear to the wind, analyzing the exchange as she listened for other groups performing funerary rites in the area. Was the priest's conduct indicative of the relationship between the temples and the aristocracy? She couldn't imagine that it was friction with the administration as a whole. From what she had seen and heard, Queen Auricula's was practically untouchable when it came to negative public sentiment. A thread of familiar prayers drew her to another group of priests several estates away. She tread more than a bit forcefully as she made her way up the manor lane in hopes that they wouldn't start at her appearance as the previous ones had. One of them turned to regard her as she approached the rows of bodies neatly arranged over the grounds. Ludmilla lowered her head in a curtsy.
"I hope the evening finds you well, priest."
The priest seemed surprised at her greeting, staring at her for a moment before raising a hand.
"Blessings of the Six be upon you," he said.
"You'll have to forgive my astonishment, but we weren't aware that any of our faithful amongst the nobility had survived aside from Mistress Salacia."
"She may have the look of a noble, a priest in the vibrant colors of the fire god said, but her manner of garb is strange. Who are you?"
"Baroness Ludmilla Zaradnik, Chief of Staff of the relief force sent to the Draconic Kingdom by the Sorceress Kingdom."
As one,
the remaining priests ceased their prayers and turned to regard her.
"I don't see a presiding cleric," Ludmilla said.
"They were lost in the attack. The Archbishop and all of the senior staff were long gone by the time it happened, and our remaining clerics went out to defend the people when the city was breached." "I see." Ludmilla looked down at the grass, making a ritual gesture. "May Sir Sana grant them his eternal peace." A moment of silence passed between them before Ludmilla's curiosity over a portion of the priest's statement prompted her to speak again. "You mentioned that the Archbishop and the senior temple staff were long gone by the time the city was breached. What happened to them?"
"They were assassinated,"
a woman in the subdued colors of the earth god spat.
"Assassinated?"
Ludmilla furrowed a brow.
"When we arrived and dealt with the invaders, we did not encounter any beastmen capable of entering a city filled with people to successfully assassinate key figures.
It happened early in the siege," the priest sighed. "The capital has rarely been attacked, but we know how other cities have suffered in the past. These filthy demi-humans have savage practices. Their warriors seek out worthy prey and go to great lengths for the prestige of defeating the strongest. They scale the walls at night and stalk the streets, searching for likely targets." Ludmilla rubbed her chin with a finger. "In that case, who are your strongest surviving priests?" "We're all only capable of first-tier magic," came the glum reply. "Just acolytes and the least advanced members of the junior staff. If contagion takes root in the city from the malaise cast by these corpses, we will have no countermeasures for it." "Is it the same with the other faiths? What about the Pharmacist Guild?" "It's all the same. There isn't a single second-tier caster left in the entire city. No clerics, no priests, no alchemists." "I see," Ludmilla sighed. "We noted the same thing in Seagate, but I wasn't certain of the cause." The priest of the fire god's gaze sharpened at her words. "Seagate?" he said. "Does that mean?" "We broke the siege of Seagate last night," Ludmilla nodded. "On both sides of the river. I was the one that requested that the capital remain closed. The same instructions have been issued to Seagate. The beastmen have depopulated the nearby territories, and sending people out at this juncture may attract more from beyond. We'll be using their ignorance of recent events to our advantage." His face brightened at her explanation. The other priests looked at one another excitedly. "This is excellent news," the man said, "but how long until the people can leave to work the fields and fish the waters again? Starvation still looms over us all." "I will be consulting with Her Majesty on that this evening," Ludmilla replied. "At any rate, the reason why I came to you is that I was wondering how things have been going in the city with all of the death lingering here. I understand that the temples are working as quickly as possible, but I must still be mindful of any security concerns." "Nothing has happened yet, my lady," the Earth Priestess said. "But it will take us weeks to see to the dead. The palace quarter will not have a very pleasant fragrance in a few days. You should be able to move them out of the city by then," Ludmilla smirked. "Thank you for your time. I need to deliver my report to the palace." "Bring the fire god's wrath upon these vile animals," one of the priests raised a fist. "Purge them from our lands." Ludmilla nodded politely before going on her way. After leaving the estate, she concealed her presence and flew back to the royal palace. The Death Knight, one of her footmen, guarding the parapet of the northwest tower, saluted when she arrived. "How have things been since I've been gone?" Ludmilla asked. Her footman stuck up a thumb. Ludmilla scanned the tower briefly before descending past the living quarters and into the war room. Wiluvian came out from behind the central table and curtsied before her. "Welcome back, my lady. Has anything interesting happened?" "Not as such," Wiluvian replied. The Katsa force has scouted out the area up to the Sealan River. We're about halfway to Bentfang Bay from the capital with our efforts here. Did I miss anything on my sweep? Wiluvian shook her head. No, my lady. The entire area seems emptied of humans so far. They went over to the table and Ludmilla examined the updated information on the war map. A smattering of beastman positions had been added roughly 10 kilometers north of the capital. The south appeared to be empty. Her eyes traveled up the nearby tributary. What about the fortress down there? I sent a shadow demon to check, Wiluvian replied. It should be back sometime tonight. The area south of the capital was a highly defensible position, but, even so, they lacked the troops to cover it. They were mostly scouting the area just in case there was a tribe hidden somewhere that could suddenly appear at an inconvenient time. How about the areas to the east? Ludmilla asked. The wraiths we sent in that direction are delivering findings that are consistent with our first look around. There's a clear shift in the way that the tribes are organized past where the Forced River joins the Orichalon. Everything east of there so far has the look of being well managed. I'm half afraid to ask what River Garden looks like. There are people in the city. Wiluvian looked down at the map. Humans. We only performed aerial reconnaissance, so the details of what's going on down there are unknown. At the least, the city is being kept in good order. What about the city's defenses? Beastmen are manning them. If it wasn't for the fact that humans are freely going in and out, one would think that they turned the city into a prison. Ludmilla's hand roamed around until she found the reports for River Garden. A frown crossed her lips as she went over the ratio of humans to beastmen. My initial assessments about consumption rates could be wrong, she said, but these numbers don't match up. Add caravans and shipping routes to the things to watch out for. Do you believe they might be exporting humans, my lady? It's a possibility. Another is that they've decided that their initial cull was too severe and they're trying to grow the human population. Speaking of livestock, what about herd animals? Wiluvian looked across the table at Psycho. The Elder Lich glanced up from writing its report. Our focus has been on identifying elements from intelligent races, Psycho said. If you would like, we can change our reconnaissance parameters. By doing so, however, our efforts will be significantly slowed. Include all economic elements to our reconnaissance of the east, Ludmilla ordered. We won't start there for a while yet, so I'd like to know as much about what's going on there as we can without informing them of our presence. We'll similarly amend the orders for the Katsa force once we're done with Blighthold. In the northwest, Beastman tribes were forming in response to the undead army creeping through the Dead March. According to Psycho, the first reactions were noted the previous evening, about an hour to midnight. Several minor skirmishes had broken out far ahead of the advancing front where they had set pickets to. Well, it wasn't exactly screening in the conventional sense, but it had still exposed the Beastman scouts and prompted them to report to their respective tribes. Did the Beastmen in the northwest move back again? They did, my lady, Wiluvian said. It's the fourth time they've pulled back ahead of our forces. She set down the report for River Garden and reached out to pick up the one for Blighthold. Between the beginning of the Beastman response and the latest update, the numbers at the front had gone from a few hundred to 2,000 to 4,000. Now everything in the area was moving to join them. I suppose they settled on making their stand at this river because it's defensible. That appears to be the case, my lady, Wiluvian said. This river runs relatively short and steep, cutting a series of deep ravines on its way to the sea. We have several major bottlenecks to contend with and the Beastmen will have the advantage of the high ground. She flipped through the report until she found the tactical map for what appeared to be their first battleground. As her maid had noted, the river would be a problematic crossing for the bulk of their forces. Skeletons and zombies would simply tumble down the ravine to their deaths and a series of defiles close to the sea were the only places where they could safely descend. There was a bridge for the road going to the Theocracy as well, but it probably couldn't handle the weight of thousands of undead crossing at once. Since our forces have bunched up like this, Ludmilla said, I assume the Beastmen are under the assumption that they can lure the undead? I'm not sure if that's the case, my lady, Wiluvian said. They may just be assuming we're going to use the easiest place to cross and preemptively move there. The Elder Liches are adhering to your orders to act as if they are simply being attracted to the closest mass of living beings nearby. Well, just to be certain, keep an eye out for flanking attempts from further upriver.
We still have no idea where their real army is, if it's even around.
Yes, my lady. Since they kept falling back and adding to their forces, she could only assume that they were doing what was necessary to match the undead army visibly arrayed against them. The strongest troops in the Katsa force were kept far in the back and out of sight. Her bone vultures and wraiths were performing reconnaissance while the lower-level undead shambled their way forward. This suggested that the Beastman army confronting them was likely made up of regular tribespeople.
Where are our extra maps stored? Ludmilla asked.
The shelf behind us, Willuvian answered. Countess Corlin has received permission for us to use the Royal Archives as well, so we can start looking for the information that you requested. That can wait until we're done with this first battle, Ludmilla said as she sifted through the materials on the shelf. When Luluvian gets up, have her wake the children and prepare them for tonight.
Yes,
my lady. Ludmilla fished up a copy of the map. After a moment's thought, she took 3 more.
One more thing,
my lady, Willuvian said. A shadow demon came over from the throne room with a message from Lord Sabos. Her maid held out a folded slip of paper. Ludmilla received it in her free hand before heading down the stairs. The content was brief. Lady Entima had requested some beastmen to sample. To whom do the beastman corpses belong, anyway? They had zombified the ones in the capital, so there was nothing to claim. The upcoming battle, however, would probably result in more than a few bodies. She put the note away and made her way to the throne room. Baroness Zaradnik.
Captain Scarvo,
Ludmilla smiled. I see the palace is still in one piece.
That it is,
my lady, the captain nodded. How are things out beyond the walls?
We haven't found a single beastman until about halfway to Rivergarden, Ludmilla replied.
Speaking of which, do you know how quickly beastmen travel? Surprisingly, not as quickly as you'd think. Maybe around as fast as a low to mid-silver ranked adventurer over long distances. They can sprint after you damn fast, though. How quickly they can march across the countryside was what I was interested in. Thank you, Captain. Is Her Majesty available? Her Majesty is inside with her cabinet at the moment, Captain Scarvo said. One moment while I inform her of your arrival. The throne room door opened and closed again as the captain made his way through. It seemed that the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation had paused negotiations for some reason. Clara? Oh, are you back? I am in front of the throne room at the moment. I thought you would be here, but we split up to do research. I am in the Royal Archives at the moment. Leanne went off to hatch some scheme and Florian went with her. Some scheme? I figured the 3 of you would be well on your way with negotiations by now. Even with the overwhelming amount of stuff we have thrown her way, Queen Auriculus is still in control of her end of things. She is quite an amazing woman. She would have to be to hold her country through all of this. You did not even say anything about it. I lost count of all the potential skills and abilities she used during our time at the table. It is like they are all second nature to her. It is not just her powers, either. She exploited every opening possible and everything she says is purposefully calculated. When she weaves everything together, it becomes ridiculous. Finally someone to look up to, I do not even know if I can even do half of what she does. Some of her capabilities are definitely sovereign class. A sigh filtered over from Clara. Why did we not have this in Riestais, Ludmilla? Everywhere we go it seems that the people have some advantage over us or are more advanced in some way. Maybe because some nefarious force decided that we should have the worst of everything. On the bright side, we have the Sorceress Kingdom now. Things are bound to get better for the region. We are here to make that happen, right? Anyway, we have unloaded the barges and we are in the process of moving our cargo to the palace quarter. Queen Auriculus knows that we are offering her an excellent deal, but she is still doing her due diligence. For the time being, we are going ahead with basic aid under the premise that she will eventually establish official relations with the Sorceress Kingdom. How are things on your end? Steps sounded from the other side of the door. It has been quiet. We have not detected a single beastman within a day of the capital by road. I was just stopping by to see her about a few things before heading over to the Dead March. Captain Scarvo is coming back out, so I will speak with you later. The way to the throne room opened and Ludmilla took a step across the threshold. The Right Honourable the Baroness of Zaradnik, Captain Scarvo announced. Ludmilla frowned inwardly. While it was technically her title, she was used to it being called Warden's Vale. She passed between the columns on the way to the throne, eyeing the changes to the hall. 2 long tables had been set up on either side of the way to the throne. On one side sat the members of Queen Auricula's cabinet. The other side was empty, presumably because it was for the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation. The queen was seated on her throne, a bare leg exposed to her hip as she crossed her legs. Behind her and to her left was Lady Yorston. On her right was Lord Sabos, who nodded slightly at her approach. "Your Majesty," she lowered herself into a deep curtsy. "We've completed our sweep of a one-day area around the capital. Aside from the liberation of Seagate, the area was devoid of beastmen and humans on this side of the river." The queen nodded. "Thank you for your hard work. We had hoped that you might be wrong about the human part, but it is what it is. What are you planning to do next?" "The tribes northwest of Blighthold have been consolidating their numbers over the past day or so. I believe they've chosen a place to confront our forces coming from the Dead March." She produced one of the spare maps, presenting the rolled-up parchment in her right hand. Lady Yorston came forward to retrieve it from her and delivered it to Queen Auriculus. The queen unfurled the map, holding it open in front of her. "We are familiar with this place, but if the beastmen are defending this position, will it not be a difficult battle? I estimate that we will lose half of our numbers." Half? "It may be half of our numbers, but it is less than 1/100th of that group's strength. Unlike the living, mindless undead may be utilized as fodder with no domestic repercussions." In the corner of her eye, the members of the Queen's cabinet shifted uncomfortably. "This may be so in the Sorceress Kingdom," Queen Auriculus said, "but even using the undead is a domestic repercussion in other countries. Our neighbors will likely not receive the news well." "That may be so," Ludmilla said, "but we are here now, and we shall not so easily abandon you. Additionally, foreign sentiment over utilization of the undead may also not be as bad as you believe it to be. The Baharuth Empire and the Kingdom of the Azalizian Mountain Dwarves are already leasing undead from the Sorceress Kingdom." "What?" A chair clattered to the floor as someone in the Queen's cabinet shot to their feet. Ludmilla turned her head to see a voluptuous woman leaning forward over the table, an ivory symbol of Allah Alaf dangling from the silver chain around her neck. This must be the Mistress Salacia that those priests were referring to. "Is something the matter, lady?" "Sorul, my lady," Lady Sorul replied. "Salacia Sorul, second daughter of House Sorul. Did you not tell them that the Baharuth Empire and the Azalizian dwarves have forged ties with the Sorceress Kingdom?" "I mentioned that we traded with them. Why?" "Well, I just told them about their leasing undead from us. Sorry. I was going to use that later, but we'll live." "While I know naught of those dwarves that you mentioned," Lady Sorrel said, "I find it difficult to believe that the Baharuth Empire would embrace the undead. The faith of the Four holds sway there and, like any right-minded faith, are staunch opponents of the enemies of all life. Are you not a follower of the Six, Lady Sorrel?" Lady Sorrel straightened, raising her chin proudly. "I am. What of it?" "The undead being leased by our allies are summoned beings, not naturally manifested ones. Slavery is illegal in the Sorceress Kingdom, besides." "I fail to see why the distinction matters," Lady Sorrel sniffed. Ludmilla eyed the woman and wondered about her unexpectedly defiant posture. "Out of curiosity, Lady Sorrel," she said, "what would you do if an undead being summoned an angel?" "That's a preposterous notion. Blasphemous, even. Such a thing would never be allowed by the gods." Queen Auriculus cleared her throat. "I believe our discussion has gone off course," she said. "We will confirm the truth of the matter with your diplomats. Since you suggest that victory will be obtained in this coming battle, what will your next move be?" "There is a second Beastman clan besieging the south of Blighthold. Securing the city will come next. At the same time, we will also be moving to break the siege of Highfoot." The queen uncrossed her legs, placing her elbows on her knees as she leaned forward. "Highfoot still stands? Beastmen still surround it, so it stands to reason that the defenders still hold the fortress. My hope was that we could relieve your soldiers and have the undead man the fortress. That way, your armies could help police the reclaimed territories. The undead may be reliable, but their presence is disruptive to living beings unaccustomed to them, and we would like to have your people resume their seasonal activities without further interruptions." "We are in agreement." Queen Auriculus leaned back on her throne. You have our permission to reorganize the Draconic Kingdom's forces as you see fit, Lady Zaradnik.
For the purposes you outlined just now, of course.
Is there anything else you wish to inform us of?
There is a matter of housekeeping, Your Majesty.
Queen Auricula's crown shimmered in the magical torchlight as she tilted her head curiously. Housekeeping? A few matters. It has been brought to my attention that news of Seagate's liberation has not been made public.
That's right.
Considering the measures that you recommended, we were uncertain whether it would interfere with your plans somehow. As long as Your Majesty does not believe that the information will somehow make its way to the Beastmen, it should be to Your Majesty's advantage to let the people know. Once again, my general staff is operating out of the Royal Palace. If any questions or concerns arise, they are easily accessible. I believe it will be for the best if we communicate both frankly and openly.
The Queen nodded.
Then we will do so. Giving our people a sense that we are making progress against our enemies will help encourage them to adhere to the mandates of the administration. Making everything a royal decree might lose its effectiveness after a while.
Ludmilla pondered the latter part of Queen Auricula's statement.
Was she referring to the people's willingness to adhere to legal authority, the intangible weight that skillful authority figures cultivated, or a skill that individuals with sovereign-type classes influenced their people with?
You mentioned a few matters, the Queen said.
Yes,
Your Majesty, Ludmilla replied.
The second notable matter is the management of the deceased as the war progresses, and we must see to the aftermath. I've spoken with a few of the temple staff performing rites in the palace quarter, and they've expressed concerns over the sheer number of corpses they must take care of. We have been made aware of this. If the beastmen continue to react as they have so far,
Ludmilla said, the corpses can be moved out of the western gates by the end of the week.
Of course, should the situation change, we will have to reassess the risks.
Very well.
What else?
We also need to determine how the dead should be managed in the areas restored to the Draconic Kingdom's control.
They were eaten, no?
I was referring to the fallen beastmen, Your Majesty.
My assumption is that they will be considered a burden for your temples to manage, as they are not the families and loved ones of your subjects.
Queen Auricula glanced towards Lady Sorul, who nodded.
This should be the case, Lady Sorul said. I hesitate to ask what Lady Zaradnik wishes to propose, however. The Sorceress Kingdom is a nation where many races exist harmoniously alongside one another, Ludmilla said. But that does not mean they stop eating what they need to eat. The slain may be prepared for consumption in our country rather than tying up the Draconic Kingdom's resources.
Why not?
Queen Auricula shrugged. Let the beastmen be the ones being eaten for a change. Our people will be busy enough restoring the lands to order and productivity, so managing the beastmen's leavings is, as you say, a burden.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
The final item is what we should do with foreign merchants.
The Queen frowned upon her marble throne.
Foreign merchants? It would be beastman merchants mainly, but we cannot discount the possibility that merchants from other countries might appear through the beastman-occupied territories.
That is a difficult question to address.
A tiny furrow appeared over Queen Auricula's brow. Carting around parts of my people is one thing, but we will have to deliberate over what should be done with the rest.
In that case, Ludmilla said, that was all that I wished to discuss for the time being.
By Your Majesty's leave, I shall attend to matters in the northwest.
The Queen nodded.
We await your favorable report.